On the left-hand side of the screen, we have NVIDIA's new RTX 5050, their most budget-oriented GPU, coming in at $250 and hitting that MSRP on the market. But I had to buy this myself. NVIDIA's not sending them out for review samples. Is there a reason for that? I think in this video we'll see yes. Now, why do I have it up against the 9060 XT 8GB version in this video? Don't these not really cost the same? Well, actually, let's look at that for a second, because the fact that both of these are 8GB GPUs, first of all, comes with some major caveats, like neither of them's running a lot of games at max settings very well right now. However, the 9060 XT 8GB, because I think people have been rejecting it, is available actually at about the same price as an RTX 5050. So in other words, if you have to buy a GPU around this price range, unfortunately, you've got to make some compromises. Which is the best option? The 5050 is coming in widely available at its MSRP of $250, but I've been tracking the price of the 9060 XT, which is meant to MSRP at $300, but I don't think they've been selling that well, probably due to the 8GB. And you can see some options listed at $250. However, to be clear, it's really $300 plus you get a $50 Newegg gift card. So if you don't think that really counts, which it really doesn't unless you can actually use that $50 as part of your build or whatever. But if you're just buying a GPU and you didn't want to spend that additional money, there is still the Power Color Reaper available at $270. This is available on Amazon. There's no gift cards or anything required. I did double check that is actually available. It's shipped and sold by Amazon. So really what we're looking at here is that you're only spending an extra $20 if you ask yourself, should I get the 9060 XT instead? So that's what we're looking at here in this video. Now, despite these both being 8GB graphics cards, one thing you're going to notice if we look at side-by-side footage and frame time graphs and stuff is that because the 9060 XT has 16 full lanes of PCIe, it doesn't suffer as badly when VRAM limited as the 5050 does in most cases, because this only has 8 lanes, so like half the PCIe lanes actually functioning. And I think that's why we're seeing the 9060 take a 77% lead at 1080p max in Monster Hunter Wilds. Now, that's still not an amazing experience because it's only hitting 46 FPS, but it is at least handling the VRAM limited situation more gracefully. Now, if you do kick on DLSS and FSR quality on the otherwise maxed out 1080p settings, which includes ray tracing, by the way, AMD has massively increased their ray tracing performance lately, we're seeing 51 FPS versus 27, so it increases to an 89% lead. Now, you might be getting to frame rates that you think are roughly playable, but look at the textures right now. These aren't supposed to be flat like that. The game is failing to properly load in the textures, so that is important to note. So even if your performance is actually getting okay on the 9060 here, it is still suffering from problems due to its 8GB of VRAM. So I really want to be clear right from the outset in this video that if your budget can stretch to one of the newer 16GB cards, like the 9060 XT 16GB version, or to a 5060 Ti 16GB version, I think it's well worth doing so. However, those are significantly more expensive, and I understand that that's just realistically not within everybody's budget. So I'm also going to be testing out medium settings in this video, not just max settings. A lot of times GPU reviews are traditionally just max things out at native resolution, but especially when looking at more budget-oriented cards, and especially cards with limited VRAM capacities, I don't think that's entirely fair for giving somebody an idea of how it'll actually be like to use the card. Also, I will be testing out 1440p as well as 1080p, because especially with high-quality upscaling like DLSS and FSR4, I think playing on a 1440p display is something that's even approachable in this price range, but at least we'll look at that in this video. Now, still on max settings so far, we can see that 1440p max settings, native resolution not running well in either GPU, although again, the 9060 is handling it a lot better, 68% faster, but it's still only 37 FPS versus 22, and we're seeing a lot of missing textures and things like that. Also, I realized I should shrink down tiny and get kind of out of the way. Why am I blocking half the screen in the side-by-sides? Let's go ahead and skip forward because obviously those aren't great settings for these GPUs. If we kick on balanced mode upscaling, so when I test out 1440p results, I will test out native resolution, but also balanced level upscaling. That's 58% internal resolution per axis. But with DLSS 4 and FSR 4, I think it looks pretty solid. However, again, still not quite enough to save the 8GB GPUs here. 45 FPS on the 9060, only 26 on the 5050. The 9060 is 73% faster, but neither one's doing great. And once again, 45 FPS might be playable on a controller, but you are missing textures and things like that. Like the creature, I'm not sure what it's called, and when I actually play this game that they're writing right here, is missing textures on its neck and things like that, making it look a lot worse than it actually does if you have enough VRAM. However, like I promised, let's switch to 1080p medium, right? This might be a more realistic look at the settings that are appropriate to the $250 GPUs these days. I remember when $250 got you a pretty solid graphics card. Well, you got to make some compromises now, but if you do make those compromises, we're seeing 70 FPS versus 44. So the 9060 is now completely playable. Notice that the textures actually look better now than they did on the max settings because they're actually fully loading in, unlike when we tried to use the max textures. 59% lead for the 9060 at 70 versus 44. The 5050, playable on a controller at 44 FPS, but you'd probably want more performance. So I'm also going to test out upscaling. And so here we're looking at DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, and that does get the 5050 up to 54 FPS. It's almost a 60 FPS experience. If you're on a variable refresh rate display, it's going to be perfectly fine. But the 9060 here is hitting 82 FPS, which is 52% faster. Now, if we move up to 1440p native resolution, the 9060 can actually almost handle that at 60 FPS, hitting 56 here, putting it 70% faster than the 5050, which is only hitting 33. Now, if we do use DLSS and FSR at the balance mode, the 5050 jumps to 47 FPS, but still not amazing, especially considering the 9060 is able to hit 70, which is 49% faster. Let's check out some other games, though. In Marvel's Spiderman 2 at 1080p max settings, both GPUs are over their VRAM capacity, and it's only 38 FPS versus 25, though once again the 9060 is handling it better by 52%. Kicking on DLSS and FSR quality doesn't fix the problem because they're still out of VRAM at the max settings. So 47 FPS versus 30, but the 1% lows are under 30 for both. The 9060 is still handling it better, 57% faster, and its 1% lows are 93% faster. But again, look at the frame time graphs, they're super spiky. Really, this game at its max settings uses just insane amount of VRAM, oftentimes even over 12, and 4K can even go over 16. Anyway, let's go to 1440p max settings, where unsurprisingly they're both getting absolutely crushed. 27 FPS versus 17, so it's another one of those Pyrrhic victories where the 9060 is crushing the 5050, by 59%, but it's not usable settings. So yeah, not really that relevant. The 1% lows, 9060 has a 75% lead, but it's 14 FPS versus 8. So not an amazing experience there. Either way, however, we can try kicking on upscaling, but again, upscaling does not fix the problem when you're over your VRAM capacity. It can when you're really borderline. If you're just barely over, lowering the internal rendering resolution sometimes gets things in check. But this is so far beyond 8 that this doesn't help. Performance is up to 35 and 23, so 52% lead for the 9060, 1% lows are an 82% lead, but at 20 versus 11. So again, it's still just a bad experience on both GPUs. So again, 8GB graphics cards in new AAA games are not going to be maxing those games out for the most part. Now, again though, if we drop to medium settings, we're now getting perfectly playable experiences on both cards. The 9060 is 48% faster at 111 versus 75, but 75 is pretty playable, so the 5050 is hanging in there now, but it is still getting crushed relatively by the 9060. The 1% lows, we're looking at 63 versus 39. So the 9060 XT manages to keep 1% lows above 60 FPS here, which the 5050 is not managing to do. Although if we kick on DLSS and FSR quality, performance does jump up again. The 5050 closes some of the gap, but the 9060 is still winning by 40%, which is still very significant at 137 versus 98. But the 5050 is still putting up 98 FPS here, and its 1% lows now are at least close to 60, hitting 56. whereas the 9060 is hitting 82, so 46% lead in the 1% lows. Overall, this game still often has blips on the frame time graph. It's just not the most smooth experience on almost any GPU. Now going up to 1440p medium settings, the 9060 is still well over 60 FPS at native resolution, hitting 75, whereas the 5050 is playable but only hitting 50 FPS, and that gives the 9060 a 50% advantage over the 5050. In the 1% lows, it's 38 FPS versus 25, so the 9060 is taking a 52% lead in this test. Now, especially for the 5050, I think it makes sense to kick on upscaling here, and even the 9060 will get a lot of benefits. Again, this game has FSR 4 and DLSS 4 available, and looks pretty good at the balanced setting here. The 9060 jumps to 107 FPS, putting it 51% faster than the 5050, but even the 5050 here is hanging in at 71 and is completely playable. Although if you look at the 1% lows, only the 9060 is able to keep them at 60 FPS, whereas the 5050 is at 40. So the 9060 is taking a 50% lead in the 1% lows. But again, both could at least get this playable at the right settings. Let's move on to another one of the biggest games of the year, which is Oblivion Remastered. At 1080p max settings, that includes trying to kick on the hardware accelerated Lumen GI. At its max settings, neither GPU is over 30 FPS, let alone 60. Now, interestingly here, the 5050 does have the lead. Now, I've noticed that when these GPUs are using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, I've noticed that usually the 9060 XT is handling that better than the 5050 is. However, one thing about spilling over VRAM capacity is sometimes it's just unpredictable. So while I think on average, the 9060 will handle it better than the 5050 does due to the increased PCIe lanes, it's not in this case. However, it's just not a good experience on either GPU. And even kicking on DLSS and FSR quality does not solve the problem. They're both still under 30 frames per second. The 9060 still trailing the 5050, but at completely unusable settings on both. But again, just an example where the 5050 is handling it better. If I had to speculate why, my guess would be that I've seen that NVIDIA GPUs tend to allocate much less VRAM in this game. So it might be that the 5050 is only trying to use a little more than 8, whereas the 9060 is trying to use a lot more than 8. So perhaps it's having to send more information over that buffer. And if you actually look at the system RAM, you can see that there's almost 3 gigabytes more system RAM allocated and over a gigabyte per reported used on the AMD side there. So potentially that has something to do with it. Now going up to 1440p max settings, it seems like now the 5050 is getting crushed so badly that the 9060 still pulls ahead here. It's 16 FPS versus 13 though, so once again, it's just completely broken on the 8 gigabyte cards. Let's skip ahead to kicking on DLSS and FSR at their balanced modes. And here we're seeing 19 FPS versus 21. The 5050 pulls ahead again, but again, it's by 2 FPS when we're both at unplayable settings. So again, just weird stuff happens when you're completely out of VRAM, but neither GPU is playable at max settings in this game. However, if you kick down to medium preset and turn off the hardware-based Lumen and switch it to software-based Lumen at its low setting, now both GPUs are actually completely playable. The 5050 hits 55 FPS, the 9060 actually hits 88. Nice high refresh rate experience for a single player title, 60% advantage for the 9060, and the 1% lows are a 53% advantage at 66 versus 43. Now, if we switch over to, let's see, did I actually try it with upscaling here? No, maybe I didn't. I thought I tried medium with upscaling, but I think performance was high enough I just went straight to 1440p. Yeah, here we go. So 1440p medium, again with software Lumen low, we're seeing the 9060 hit 55 FPS, which is actually what the 5050 was hitting at 1080p. So this one's a lot more comfortable at 1440p here, giving it a 49% advantage over the 5050, which is only hitting 37 FPS in this setting test. However, once again, we can use DLSS and FSR. If we kick them onto the balance settings, it actually completely closes the gap in the averages. We're at 71 versus 73 here. But in the 1% lows, the 9060 is still taking a 27% lead at 56 versus 44. If we switch over to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the maximum settings don't run well on either GPU once again, and once again I believe we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. The 9060 is 33% faster, but it's only 28 versus 21, so these aren't the settings you're going to use on either GPU. Using DLSS and FSR quality doesn't really solve the problem. The 5050 gains some performance, but it's still only at 27 FPS, and the 9060 is only at 29, so leading by 7% at settings you're not going to use. If we switch over to 1440p max, interestingly, the 5050 gets crushed a lot harder than the 9060, but once again, it's a completely Pyrrhic victory. The 9060 is losing too much performance for it to be meaningful at 24 versus 7. And at 1440p max with DLSS and FSR set to balanced, the 5050 is again getting crushed harder, but both are doing badly. It's 25 FPS versus 8. If we switch over to medium settings, though, suddenly we're at a nice, smooth, high refresh rate experience, and this game is actually extremely well optimized. Look how smooth that frame time graph is. It's a beautiful thing. Wow, like seriously, that is just a flat, stable line. Frame pacing is amazing. 119 FPS versus 90, 32% lead for the 9060. And switching up to 1440p medium, even the 5050 is almost a 60 FPS experience here, 59, with still a very smooth frame time graph, and the 1% lows are only 54. Look how close the 1% lows are to the averages. This is what a smooth experience looks like. 9060 is hitting 82 FPS at 39% advantage over the 5050. And again, a beautiful thing looking at the 1% lows versus the averages. It's nice to see a game actually run smooth. Anyway, 1440p medium, you can still kick on DLSS and FSR at their balanced modes. We still have FSR4 available here, and it's 110 FPS versus 85, 29% lead for the 9060 in both the averages and the 1% lows, which again are both close together, a nice and smooth experience. But switching over to Assassin's Creed Shadows, 1080p max settings, I believe we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM again. And that's leading to some especially bad performance on the 5050, not that the 9060 is doing well either. So once again, they're both under 30 FPS. Even if you get a 40% lead on the 9060, these aren't settings you're going to use. If we switch over to 1080p max settings, which again does use a lot of ray tracing using DLSS and FSR quality, and we do have FSR4 available again, and it looks good. We're getting 33 FPS versus 24, so really not a great experience, and the 1% lows are still showing signs that we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, causing stutters. If we switch up to 1440p max settings, it's no surprise that they're doing even worse now, 23 FPS versus 18. I don't think we need to say any more. And 1440p max with DLSS and FSR at the balanced mode, we're at 29 FPS versus 24, so still not a good experience. However, if we switch down to medium settings and turn the hardware-based ray tracing off, or at least as off as it gets, you can switch it to hideout only, and I don't think this benchmark pass goes through the hideout, so it's effectively RT off. We're seeing 79 FPS versus 58, so even the 5050 is able to play it at about 60 FPS on native 1080p if you're playing at the medium settings with RT disabled. It's 79 FPS versus 58, so 36% advantage for the 9060 here. If we kick on 1440p resolution, it's now 60 FPS versus 45. The 9060 is winning by 33%. And again, the 9060 here is able to play 60 FPS at a native 1440p as long as you're at the medium settings, which help you stay within the 8GB VRAM buffer. If we kick on DLSS and FSR balance, then even the 5050 goes over 60 FPS, and in fact, it closes the gap to within 6% at 70 versus 66 here. Now, if we move to Clair Obscur Expedition 33 at 1080p max settings, we see some signs of being over VRAM when we load into a new area, causing spikes on the frame time graph. After a while in this area, it does kind of smooth out a bit. But again, do note that 1080p max settings are still showing some blips on 8GB cards in this game. It's 50 FPS versus 36, so playable here, but probably want to tune things down, especially to make sure you're always within 8GB VRAM buffer. At 1080p max settings with DLSS quality, the 5050 is at 61 FPS now, and it did lower the resolution just enough to be within the 8GB buffer. Things look smooth now. But there's no FSR available in this game, so I set XeSS, which it does have, to the same internal resolution as DLSS, 67% per axis, and it gets the 9060 to 70 FPS, which reduces its lead to 15%, and its image quality does look a little blurrier and a little more aliased at times to me. At 1440p max settings, neither GPU is doing well, and we are definitely over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Look at those spikes on the frame time graph and awful 1% lows. So these are not the settings you're going to use. But if you use DLSS balanced, the 5050 does reach 49 FPS, which is fairly playable, but still probably not the frame rates you're looking for. And XeSS at the same internal resolution just gets the 9060 to 50 FPS, which is only a 2% lead. So I don't think it gains as much performance as FSR would have, and it doesn't look as good as FSR4 would have. You can use Optiscaler to get FSR4 modded into this game, although, you know, that's a kind of a hassle, and I've heard some reports that it might not be completely stable and crash occasionally. I'm not sure if that's been sorted out in more recent nightly builds. Anyway, 1080p medium settings, we're seeing 84 FPS versus 60s, and it's running fine on the 8 gigabyte card. So really, honestly, the medium settings in this game also look almost identical to max. So probably just play this game at medium settings and both GPUs do great, although the 9060 is winning by 40%. At 1440p medium settings, we're seeing 58 FPS versus 41, so the 9060 takes a 41% lead and could probably just play 1440p medium native resolution without too much issue. You're just barely shy of 60 FPS here. However, you can kick on DLSS balanced on the 5050, getting it to 75 FPS. Again, no FSR4 available here, so I'm using XeSS at the same internal resolution as the DLSS balanced, which gets it to 88 FPS. 17% performance lead for the 9060. I'd say small visual quality loss though, so DLSS is looking better here. So yeah, again, one of the shames not to have FSR4 available. Switching over to Doom the Dark Ages, which does require ray tracing at all times. You can't disable it. We're seeing 1080p. Now, the max settings are the non-path traced max settings, so Ultra Nightmare. A while after launch, a couple months later, they added a path tracing mode, but this is the previous max settings. So Ultra Nightmare, 68 FPS versus 50, the 9060 is 36% faster. And using DLSS for quality gets the 5050 up to 70 FPS. Now, this is another game that does not have FSR4 support, this time due to Vulkan, which this game runs on, to my knowledge, still not having FSR4 support. So with that being the case, the 9060 can use FSR3, but that doesn't look as good as FSR4 or DLSS4. So while the performance is now 38% faster than the 5050, it doesn't look as good. Moving up to 1440p max settings, I think we're seeing another situation where the 9060 is handling being over 8 gigabytes of VRAM better than the 5050 is, especially when you look at the 1% lows as a 64% advantage at 36 versus 22. That being said, though, it's another one of those kind of Pyrrhic victories where it's like neither one's doing great. 42 FPS versus 29, not the kinds of frame rates you want to be playing a Doom game on. So if we switch to upscaling, DLSS 4 does not save the day for the 5050. It gets it to 39 FPS, which is still not great. However, the 9060 can get to 72 FPS using FSR3 balanced, but it doesn't look super good. I know, especially in dark scenes like this, YouTube compression is probably crushing it, but yeah, it's definitely looking more blurry than the DLSS image, but it's, hitting a higher frame rate. Anyway, how about we try 1080p medium settings? Here, both GPUs are more at home, 86 FPS versus 56, and the 9060 is taking a 54% lead and an even larger one in the 1% lows. Switching over to 1440p medium, we're getting 55 versus 37. So the 9060 is doing okay here, and it has a 49% advantage. The 5050 is not doing great at only 37. Using DLSS balance gets the 5050 up to 61 FPS. And the 9060 now has that trade-off where, okay, the upscaler doesn't look as good, but it does have a lot more performance at 96 FPS, giving it a 57% performance lead, but not an image quality advantage. So realistically, I'd probably be using less aggressive upscaling on the 9060, whereas the 5050, I think, could get away with using it more aggressively here because it has a better image quality output. Now, switching over to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at 1080p max settings, we're seeing 75 FPS versus 61, 23% advantage for the 9060, and there's no need to use upscaling. However, if you do, DLSS quality looks pretty good here and gets the 5050 up to 74 FPS. However, the 9060 doesn't have access to either XeSS or FSR here. It just has Unreal Engine 4s, because this is still an Unreal Engine 4 game, TAAU upscaling, which looks quite blurry in comparison. So realistically here, on the 9060, I would either use Optiscaler to mod in FSR4, which I've covered how to do on the channel, and it looks great. Or if I wasn't seeking to mod the game, I would probably just play it at native resolution, which it was doing fine. At 1440p max settings, we're getting 58 FPS versus 45. The 9060 is taking a 29% performance lead and is playable, but the 1% lows don't look very good, so I think we're seeing some signs of being over 8 gigabytes of VRAM at times here. If we switch to 1440p max with DLSS quality, the 5050 hits 58 FPS, and using TAAU at the same resolution, the 9060 hits 74, but looks noticeably blurrier. So once again, probably try to mod in FSR4 here. 1080p medium settings, we're looking at 86 versus 70, 23% advantage for the 9060, and there's no need to use upscaling or anything. Both GPUs are doing fine. And 1440p medium settings, 67 FPS versus 53. The 9060 is 26% faster, and again, doesn't need to use upscaling. However, if we do, DLSS quality does look noticeably better, hitting 69 FPS, which is pretty nice. And the 9060 is hitting 88, but looking pretty bad while doing it. So once again, I'd recommend modding FSR4 in using Optiscaler. And that is all of the benchmarks that I ran. It's kind of a lot. So how do we make sense out of all of this? Well, how about we switch into some slides. So this is the average FPS of all of the tests that I ran here. The 9060 XT is in red, and the 5050 is in blue. I don't mix red and green on, I get asked about this, like, why not use red for the NVIDIA GPU? Some people are red-green colorblind, and so I know you can use different shades, like light and dark shades to try to help with that, but I figured just going with red and blue makes sense, but I did at least this time put the AMD GPU as red. I didn't do that on one of my last videos and got a lot of comments about it. Anyway, so 9060 XT is red, 5050 is blue. We got a 50 FPS line, which I would say is like pretty playable. 100 FPS is like nice high refresh rate experience. And what we can see is in the biggest, AAA games released in 2025, you're not getting a lot of like 100 FPS experiences on these GPUs. However, the red line certainly gets closer to it than the blue line does. And then if we look at the 50 FPS line, which like I would say is like, that's more just like, pretty reasonably playable on a variable refresh rate display, then we can see again, there's a lot of cases where the red line gets close, but the blue line is falling pretty short. That being said, there's a lot of combinations where both are just well short of a playable experience. So I think we really need to sort this a little bit more. So, but one thing I want to do before we narrow down which games we're testing, though, is to get a look at, so how much faster is the 9060 XT on average? So this is all of those same tests again. It's about 60 benchmarks. I didn't count exactly. We have the numbers here are now the percentage advantage. So these aren't frame rate values. These are percentage differences. So a positive direction I've assigned as a percentage advantage for the 9060 XT, and the negative direction is a percentage deficit for the 9060 XT. So there were those few instances where the 5050 was faster. However, remember, those were at unplayable VRAM limited situations in Oblivion Remastered. So there's that. Now, on average, using the geomean to calculate it, which is somewhat more outlier resistant and has other advantages when talking about percentage changes and whatnot. The point is the average is about a 40% lead for the 9060 XT. So on average, the 9060 XT is 40% faster in these 60 or so benchmarks that we've done here. But like we said, some of these settings are not settings that we'd really want to use, and how can we summarize the overall results better? So I think this is maybe something worth looking at. This is the average FPS at just medium graphics settings. Now, The important thing to note here is I'm still mixing 1080p and 1440p results, and there's also some upscaling results in here as well, and I will separate those out more in a minute. But we can see that if we switch to just using medium settings, that this 50 FPS line of being pretty playable is definitely achieved by the 9060 XT in almost every case. Whereas the blue line often falls below it, although upscaling can often push it above that especially at 1440p. So how about we start breaking that down a bit more? However, before we break down those results more, how about we look at the percentage advantage again? So limiting to just these tests, so just medium settings. Sorry, this is 1440p medium settings. I'm getting a 36% faster result, and then so I guess that wasn't all of the tests on there. But here I wanted to jump down to 1080p. Sorry, I didn't sort the slides in the exact order I meant to, but we'll keep pushing through. So 1080p medium results is what we're seeing here. So if we switch to 1080p medium, what we're noticing is that both GPUs are pretty playable. So again, if we have our 50 FPS line, the red bar is above 50 FPS at all times and is often close to 75 FPS, which I would deem a really smooth single player experience. And these were mostly single player titles, AAA titles we were testing. Whereas the blue line is often at least at the 50 FPS line and somewhat above. But was below at least once in Monster Hunter Wilds, so that's where I included an upscaling result. So the only upscaling result here is this one, which does show that the 50/50 can get above that mark if it does enable upscaling. But you can see here just how much faster the 9060 XT is, and that it gives you a very good experience if you're tuned down to medium settings at 1080p, which is what we're looking at here. So at that, if that's what you're targeting, the 9060 XT does a very good job. The 50/50 is okay, but the 9060 XT is a lot faster. At 1080p medium settings, on average, the 9060 XT is 44% faster. And so that's pretty significant considering it doesn't cost much more money at current pricing. Now, if we go to 1440p medium settings, then this is what things look like. At 1440p medium settings, I had to show the upscaling result in most cases to get decent results here. So what we're really looking at is in each game, okay, 1440p medium native, and then 1440p medium upscaled. So what we see here is that the blue line often requires, so the RTX 5050 often requires upscaling to get to near or over 50 FPS, whereas the red line, the 9060 XT, is often actually quite playable at a native 1440p, and then the upscaling is often the icing on the cake to reach more smooth experiences, oftentimes breaking that 75 FPS line, or even occasionally breaking 100 frames per second, which the 5050 never managed to do in any of these 1440p results, even with upscaling enabled. It is important to note that none of this is frame generation enabled, but oftentimes you'd want to be hitting at least 50 to 60 FPS before kicking on frame gen for the best experience. Now let's look at this, which is this is what I actually meant to show earlier, which is all of the medium settings results with the percentage differential. So sorry it's a bit out of order, but this is 1080p and 1440p, upscaling and native all mixed together. The percentage differential is the 9060 XT is 39% faster on average, which again is pretty similar to the overall result we had anyway. Now, the other thing we can look at here is maximum settings. And the thing is, the maximum settings are not particularly usable on either GPU. Now, if you look at it as an average difference, the 9060 XT is 41% faster on average, and there's a couple big outliers where it's way faster, but those weren't at particularly usable settings. There's also a few outliers where the 5050 is faster, but again, those weren't at usable settings, and just weird stuff happens when you run out of VRAM. So if we continue along here, this is what the average FPS looks like at max settings. So at max settings, I think the thing to really note here is that this 50 FPS line, which again I would deem as pretty playable, is occasionally reached, or at least close to reached, by the 9060 XT. and is very rarely reached by the 5050, and oftentimes not reached by either of them. In other words, 8GB graphics cards in new games, new AAA games that launched in 2025, are typically not suitable for maximum graphics settings. Now, depending on the game, you could still get to decent experience, so it's not in every game, but it's frequently a bad experience on an 8GB card. Now, what if we sort by monitor resolution? So 1080p max settings. So again, I've got a lot of people who still say, 8GB is plenty for 1080p. It's really just not the case if you're playing the latest games, and that's probably going to continue to get worse as time goes on. So if you're playing older games or esports games, yeah, 8GB is still plenty for max settings in tons of stuff. But the newest games, which is what we're testing here, released in 2025, for the most part, it's not. Even when in Monster Hunter Wilds, the 9060 XT was reaching decent performance, remember that the side-by-side footage revealed that it was missing textures and so was still not offering a good experience. Then we get into games like Oblivion Remastered, where max settings, even with upscaling, is just completely out of the question. Assassin's Creed Shadows, max settings, even with upscaling, is completely out of the question. And then you've got games like Clair, Obscur, Expedition 33, where upscaling seemed to mostly get the VRAM in check, and then Doom the Dark Ages was okay, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was okay. But the majority of the new games released in 2025 are not good at max settings, even at 1080p, even using upscaling on 8GB graphics cards. And that's important to note if you're planning on buying one of these, that is a compromise you're accepting. If we look at the percentage differential, it's a 30% advantage for the 9060 XT. Why is it actually less here? Well, I think it's just that oftentimes when you're spilling over the VRAM buffer, both cards are getting their performance smashed pretty hard, and weird things happen and all of that. But the point is, it's not particularly usable. If we move up to 1440p max settings, we see things get even worse. Now here I am showing the balanced level upscaling result in every single game, but even with that, we are rarely, look, here's the 60 FPS line, guys. 60 FPS was only achieved twice, both times by the 9060 XT, and both times using aggressive upscaling. The 5050 only gets close to 60 FPS at max settings once, and that's in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is quite frankly kind of an older style game with using Unreal Engine 4, and it still doesn't actually hit 60 FPS. So again, 1440p max settings is just not going to be a good experience on either GPU, not even close. Now, the percentage differential is now 51% faster for the 9060 XT, but the settings were overall not particularly usable, and we now have some big outliers that are kind of throwing off those results. And again, when making this final decision, we do need to think about that pricing. The 9060 XT is available for more money than the 5050, but not by a lot. Again, $270 available on Amazon, including me checking that it is actually in stock, able to be delivered at that price, shipped and sold by Amazon. So it is $20 more. So where does that leave us? $270 versus $250. I think if that was your budget, if your budget was $250, I hesitate to tell people to spend over their budget, but if $250 was your budget, I do think $270 is probably attainable. And again, there was that new egg option with the $50 off gift, the $50 gift code or gift card. But again, that's only usable if you're actually going to spend the extra $50 anyway. So I think this is the more fair way to look at it. It's 8% more money. Now, for that 8%, you're getting 40% more performance on average. If we divide the 1.4 by the 1.08, you're effectively talking about the value improvement. So in other words, the 9060 XT is 30% better value. So by spending that extra $20, you get 40% more performance and 30% better frames per dollar, or performance per dollar, if you want to think about it that way. Now, overall, I'm hesitant to recommend 8GB GPUs in general, for the valid reason that we saw what it's like to play with them if you're trying to play near maximum settings in most new games released, and that's going to continue to get worse. However, I also showed that if you tune down to the medium graphics settings, things can actually look pretty okay. So if we're playing at medium graphics settings, even at 1440p, you can get a reasonable result. At 1080p, even at native resolution, you can get a reasonable result. But the 9060 XT is doing a much better job. Now, there's always the, NVIDIA advantages and things like that. Like they have certain advantages in a lot of productivity software. I'm not sure the 5050 is really a productivity powerhouse anyway. There is multi-frame gen and things like that. But in general, I really just think that the 9060 XT is offering so much more performance at roughly the same price that it would be kind of silly not to get it instead of the 5050 if you were buying in this price class. It's enough of a raw performance advantage to, I think, make up for any of the feature set advantages of NVIDIA's cards. The biggest one for gaming is really just broader DLSS 4 support. But the Optiscaler can help you out in single-player titles to mod in FSR4 support. It usually works well. Occasionally it crashes. And then in multiplayer titles, that's less available. That being said, then though, the DLSS is primarily being used to boost performance, and the 9060 XT already has a raw 40% performance advantage, which I think more than makes up for any of that loss. So if you're going to buy a GPU for around $250, I highly recommend that it be the 9060 XT 8GB rather than the RTX 5050 if pricing looks like this in your region. I am aware that not every region has the same pricing, but this is what it looks like in the United States, and this is how the two cards stack up performance-wise in all regions. So you can at least use the performance data to adjust for what your region's pricing looks like and decide if that makes sense for you. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. If you are interested in the side-by-side footage, but watching the entire 52 minutes of it without me talking and without me skipping forwards, so you can look at the texture differences and the frame time graphs and all of that. It was too long to fit into this video, but I did post it on the channel members feed as just a members extra. You can click the join button to join the members on the channel, directly support me, which I massively appreciate, and I think the lowest price is like $2 to get access or something like that. And again, the intention here is not to paywall this content. This content, the side-by-side footage was produced for this video. This is the content. But if you want to peruse the 52 minutes in peace, that is up there as a thanks to channel members, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.